My name is Lindell Ormsbee, and I'm at the University of Kentucky, and I basically served as the initial director of the Kentucky Research Center for Energy and Environment. We started this back in 2003. Following several years of working at the Paducah site, we actually got started around 1994, and the initial work was done through the Kentucky Water Resources Research Institute, which I serve as the director of that as well. And that started back in the 90s. We created something called the Federal Facilities Oversight Unit, which had about 25 employees that worked mainly at Frankfurt, but they were all UK employees. And so we looked at a lot of issues with regard to the Paducah plant. So what I'm going to summarize today is some of the work that was done focusing on trying to come up with new ways to address a couple of the chemical contamination issues at the site. Two chemicals in particular. One is a compound called PCBs, which is actually a family of molecules or chemicals, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and another chemical called TCE, which is a degreaser compound that was used at the site that also has some health issues. So we're going to look at some technologies that we've developed working with some of the researchers at UK. One of the main researchers that's been involved in this work is Dr. D.B. Bhattacharya, and then also he's had several PhD students that have worked with us over the years, and one of the more recent ones was a student, Mingwang Wu, who did some of the more recent work on this project. So I'm going to summarize briefly some of the motivation for what we were looking at, and then focus on these two different compounds, these two different contaminants that are at the site, TCE and then also PCBs, and look at some of the different strategies that we came up with to try to remediate the contamination at the site using both what are called oxidative and reductive strategies, and these are two different ways that we can use chemistry basically to fix things. So the broader motivation behind this research is looking at Superfund sites. The Paducah site is one of those. There's a whole range of sites at the federal and state level that constitute what we might call a Superfund site. Kentucky has sort of three different levels of sites. They have sort of state sites. These are sites that are kind of managed by the state government or are being financed relative to their cleanup using state funds. This may be something as simple as a leaking gas tank, for example, at a service station. Then we have some other sites that are more significant that fall under the federal domain, and those are highlighted in little red or orange dots on the map here. You can see how they're dispersed. And then finally we have a set of sites that are under a program called the National Priority List Program, and those are kind of super sites. And we had initially about 20 of those. We're now down to about 14 that are still active. And the Paducah plant is one of those, and by far and away it's the largest facility, the largest Superfund site we have, and that's over here in McCracken County. This 17 spot here is the location of that plant. So we're going to look at two chemicals that exist at the site that are causing concerns. These chemicals can cause cancer and other issues. And the first of these is a compound called TCE. Just a little bit of background about this. This is a non-flammable chemical, so it doesn't burn. You can see some of the characteristics here on the slide. It's colorless, has sort of a sweet odor to it. And these chemicals were produced in 1927. They were used for a lot of things, and what a lot of people are kind of surprised to find, they were actually used for general anesthesia actually as late as the 1970s, but mainly it was used as a solvent. So it was used in industrial processes to clean equipment. You would take a piece of equipment and put it in a bath of this compound, and it would strip off all the different residue. And it's also used extensively in the dry cleaning industry as well. Due to research that started to find that this was a carcinogen, could cause problems, it was banned in the food and pharmaceutical industry in the 1970s, but it's still been used somewhat in industrial applications, for example, in dry cleaning and so on. In response to some of these concerns, EPA set some regulatory limits of this chemical. For example, the maximum limit of allowable in drinking water is a value of 0.005 milligrams per liter. When we look at the federal Superfund sites, at least half of those sites have TCE contamination. So it's a very systemic problem across the country. There's a lot of sites that have significant TCE contamination, obviously Paducah, but there's also some sites, for example, in Tucson, Arizona. Camp Lejeune, North Carolina is a very famous contamination situation where a lot of Marines and their family members were exposed to high TCE contamination, some of their children. So there's a lot of health issues that came about as a result of that. And then there's some other sites as well that are listed here. At the Paducah site, this compound got into the groundwater, and so it contaminated basically drinking water wells that people in the area were using for their drinking water sources. It also contaminated some wells and some farms. But this slide shows you sort of what this groundwater plume looks like. We have the sort of an aerial photograph of the site shown here, and you can see the extent of this plume. This is about 3 miles from the site to the Ohio River, which is up here. So this is a massive contamination plume. It's one of the largest in the DOE complex. And so one of the challenges is, what are we going to do with this? There's a lot of homes in this area, for example, that had groundwater wells that were exposed. And so as an interim step, the Department of Energy came in and provided drinking water to these folks in this area. But we still have these plumes, some of which the concentrations are exceeding this maximum limit of 5 micrograms per liter here, which is this value right here. So you can see some of these orange and red concentrations. Those are exceeding the regulatory standard. So one of the challenges is, what are we going to do with this? How are we going to tackle that? So our research was looking for ways to try to remediate or clean that up. And currently DOE's used a strategy to try to kind of contain the contamination as much as they can. They use something called pump and treat. This is again a map of the facility here. And the Department of Energy had a couple of well fields that were installed. That's these yellow arrows, or these yellow circles here. And what they would do is they would pump the groundwater up and try to strip the chemical in the water out of the water through some techniques we'll mention a little later on. And then they would allow this pump water to be discharged either to the atmosphere or to some of the streams nearby. So that was really not a sort of a long-term remediation strategy. It was kind of a way to keep the plumes from growing and things getting worse. So what we were looking at is a couple of ways maybe to try to actually treat the plumes themselves. And one of the first things we looked at is to use something called an in situ approach. All that means is putting something into the groundwater in the aquifer itself to try to clean that up. And so there are different ways we could do that. If we had some type of chemical or non-toxic material we could put into the groundwater, we could use some injection wells and put stuff down that might interact with the contaminated chemicals and try to clean that up. So that was one of the first strategies that we looked at. And in trying to come up with what could we put into the groundwater that would help break down the chemicals, we looked at technology that's been around for a while, but we looked at some modifications to that. And so the first technology we looked at is using a chemical process called oxidation. And what we do is we take some iron, either what we normally think about as rust, or there's another form called magnetite. And you can take either one of these forms, and if you add hydrogen peroxide in the presence of those metals, hydrogen peroxide, just like you would take off your shelf maybe at home, only this would be higher concentrations. It turns out there's a chemical reaction that happens when you mix iron with hydrogen peroxide. and this is the chemical form of hydrogen peroxide. You have 2 hydrogen atoms and 2 oxygen atoms. And when you do this, when you mix these forms of iron with hydrogen peroxide, it generates something called a hydrogen atom that's made up of oxygen and hydrogen, and basically you have a missing electron, and so this thing's looking to sort of scavenge something rather than grab onto something. And what that does is it basically tries to grab on and pull off these chlorine atoms off this TCE molecule. So here we have what TCE is. It's trichloroethylene. It's made up of 2 carbon atoms that has a double bond here, and we have 3 chlorine atoms, and a little hydroxyl radical comes off to the side. And what creates the toxicity or the health concerns are these chlorine atoms. So this process basically will allow us to strip off these chlorine atoms and replace them with hydroxyl radicals. And when we do that, it makes the molecule less toxic, or if we get all of them off, it makes it no longer toxic. So that's basically the idea behind doing this. Now, if you just take some bulk iron and throw some hydrogen peroxide in it, what happens is this is a very fast reaction. It can create a lot of heat, and it may use up a lot of hydrogen peroxide in the process. So this reaction may be too fast. So that's one problem with this technology. If we put it down in the groundwater, for example, we could create excess heat, and we may have to bring a lot of hydrogen peroxide in to do that. And hydrogen peroxide, the concentrations we would need, hydrogen peroxide itself, trying to transport it to the site and so on, could become a safety issue, putting this on train cars and so on. So that's another concern. So those are 2 potential problems. Strategies that have been tried before with things like with the iron is to actually excavate and put this down into the earth basically, and kind of build a wall that has this iron in it. And as the TCE would flow through this material, you would start to get some of this reaction occurring as well, naturally. Not as efficient if we added a bunch of hydrogen peroxide. But what we found is these iron walls or these iron barriers can become clogged up, and so they're not very efficient over a limited amount of time. So that's another potential problem. So how can we get around some of those problems? So our researchers looked at ways to do that. And another approach we can take, in addition to the oxidative approach, is to take something called a reductive approach. So this is a different way to tackle the problem using chemistry. And in this case, what we do, instead of using magnetite or rust, is known as like iron 3 or iron 2, we can use what's called zero-valent iron, which is another form of iron in which we don't have any extra charge on the iron because we have a balance with the electrons, whereas before we had this sort of imbalance. And what researchers have found is if you have this zero-valent iron and you have that in contact with TCE, you can get another reaction, again, where we have these chlorine atoms can be stripped away and replaced by hydrogen atoms using something called a reductive process. So this is another chemical approach that we can use. Again, similar to the other type of approach, the oxidation approach, this process also has some problems. This problem can be very, very slow. Remember, the last problem we had with the oxidative process can be very fast, and we couldn't necessarily control things. This has got the opposite problem, is where it can be very slow. So one way to solve this, we discovered, is if you take just a little bit of some extra metal, such as something called palladium. You can also use nickel sometimes. You just take a small fraction, like 1 or 2% per mass, and you add this other metal to the zero-valent iron. It turns out you can extremely accelerate the process. In fact, you actually use a slightly different chemical process. So the presence of this extra little metal, this palladium, sets up another reactive spot for this chemical reaction that will accelerate the process. So that becomes an alternative strategy that we can use. And instead of using just normally sized iron, if we use very, very, very small diameters of iron down to a level we call nanoparticle iron, that turns out to be much more efficient with regard to the reaction as well. So we've been looking at using these sort of bimetallic systems where you have two metals in concert together. And what we've found is that when you have a little bit of iron with palladium, that the reaction rate is much quicker, takes less time to get the same reduction in your chlorine atoms than it does with sort of this larger iron. In both cases here we have the iron using this nanoparticle size. Okay, so we did a lot of research. We found, hey, we can manufacture these nanoparticles. We can add some additional iron to them, or it's an additional metal rather, and we can develop a very efficient system. So one strategy might be to take these very small particles, put them into the groundwater aquifer. Because of their size, they can actually move through with the water, and as they're moving, they could start to break down the TCE. Well, around 2004, some people started having some concerns about putting nanoparticles into the environment. The Europeans were kind of first ones to raise some concerns here. In 2004, the Royal Academy of Engineering kind of came out with a recommendation saying, hey, we don't necessarily think this is such a great idea, and we think we should probably prohibit use of nanoparticles in remediation in an in situ application where you're actually just putting the stuff in the ground and letting it flow around for the time being. And then there was an additional organization that came along in 2005 in Europe, and they listed environmental remediation as certainly one of the potential benefits of this type of technology. But they are also saying, hey, but we really don't know what are the potential health impacts if this got into the environment, how it might affect the aquatic life or other species out there. What if it got into drinking water, people started drinking this stuff, could that cause problems? And then back over in North America, Quebec Commission came out in 2006 and made a point that the importance of increasing the amount of research on potential environmental consequences needs to be done to determine whether this is going to be a health issue. And then finally in 2007, DuPont basically made a decision that they would not use this technology for remediation type applications until they really had a better understanding of what some of the health concerns were. More recently then, EPA came out with a paper talking about the use of nanotechnology in an in situ remediation strategy, which was one of the things we were initially looking at, and where they acknowledged that this type of technology seems to be really good for cleaning up things. We're still not quite confident that there may not be some unintended consequences. So right now we're kind of saying maybe we shouldn't be using these in situ applications. So as a consequence of that, we went kind of back to the drawing board. We have a technology that we found that really works well. How do we deliver it to solve the problem? And looking at this aggregation problem that we had briefly talked about, one of our solutions we came up with was to take the nanoparticles and embed them into a membrane so that we could then use the membrane as a way to prevent the particles from aggregating together, also prevent them from being released into the environment. So that was a way to maybe address some of those issues. Then instead of just dumping these into the aquifer, we could either have reactors using a traditional pump and treat system or some other strategies that I'll mention momentarily, where we would basically still use the efficiency of the technology but avoid some of the problems. And then one of the things I hadn't really talked about, when you develop these nanoparticles, traditionally there's a chemical process that's being used, which is not necessarily a real nice chemical process either from a toxic standpoint as far as byproducts and so on. So we also spent some time looking for ways to produce these nanoparticles that would avoid use of some of these more toxic chemicals. And what we stumbled upon working with some folks at EPA was that it turns out you can actually use green tea, has a chemical in it that will do the same thing as this more toxic chemical, and that could be done to help produce these systems as well. So we now came up with a green technology with regard to how we could produce these. Given that we had a technology that worked, there were some concerns about it, we came back and modified the technology, combined another technology, membrane technology, and then we started looking again at the site, but now using what we would call an ex situ strategy. What that simply meant was we would take the contaminated water out of the ground and then treat it outside of the groundwater, where the water could then be put back into a stream or even potentially could be put back into the groundwater. So with the technology in hand, we started looking at sites where DOE had installed a series of wells, pumping wells, as part of their pump and treat system, and started looking for ways maybe to use those sites as ways to test the technology. And then also there is a site on the lower Little Bayou Creek where this plume actually comes to the surface in the stream. So we have some of this chemical is moving up to the surface. And so that gave us another potential site maybe to look at some technology. So one of the first technologies we looked at was potentially using something called a geosiphon. And what that basically means, you think of a siphon, is having some way to pull water out of these groundwater wells that could be basically used to pull water down into this creek, and we could put in some type of membrane system here where the contaminated water could flow, be treated through that, and then discharged into the river. So we spent some time looking at that system, ultimately interacting with DOE and some of the regulators. They decided that this may not be the most efficient strategy, certainly from a cost perspective, although from a technical perspective, it potentially could also be used to clean up some of the problems, certainly more likely on the northeast side of the plume. With that investigation, we then went back and started focusing on the existing pump and treat system. DOE installed a series of wells on the east side of the plant. This is the east side corner up here of the plant, trying to address this one plume that went off to the right or the northeast. They have a facility out there where they pump this water up and then they push this water over to some, initially for several years, they would push the water over to some old cooling towers, and they use that, would use that to airstrip the chemical out of the water. And so that was one site there. And then on the west side of the plant, they had another cluster of these pumps where they would be pumping this contaminated water up. They would then take it to basically to a treatment facility where they could run that through some different technologies and treat that. This is a picture of that facility. This is on the northwest corner of the plant. And this is just a process design of some of the technologies that they have in that facility. They have an air stripper, they have some column separators, some other technology. And so one of the things we began looking at is there ways that we can improve this overall technology using this membrane technology so that the process would be just as efficient or more efficient, and then do that at a lower energy and overall lower cost perspective. So one of the things that we started looking at then was to embed these nanoparticles into a membrane system where we could use this reductive process that we found to be very efficient. So this slide just kind of summarizes some of the research that was done on how you build these systems. And what you have is a polymer system, basically. This is sort of a cross-section of looking through one of these filter layers. And so you have the overall structure of the filters made of a chemical called a polyvinylidene fluoride, or PVDF. This is kind of standard in the industry, so you can make those. You can then create these pores in this material. You can use another compound called a polyacrylic acid that basically builds a mesh almost, as you can see here, that you can then basically add things to that will be held in that mesh that can be used to help treat any chemical or water that will be passing through the filter. So this slide just kind of summarizes some of the chemistry and the background of that. and how you would basically embed these nanoparticles in there. First we have this cross-linked PAA filter. We then can go through an ion exchange process with sodium, and then we use an ion exchange with +2 iron that gets embedded. Then we can use this sodium bromide process. That was the process I was talking about that from a chemical standpoint is a little toxic. What that allows us to do is ultimately convert and create these nanoparticles, which are these little black dots here, and then we can do a post-coating where we add a little bit of this other metal, in this case palladium, to build our system. So this summarizes kind of the dynamics and the process where we go through and manufacture these things. One of the things we did is research on different chemical compounds, like in green tea, that we found out will do the same thing. And one of the ways that we found was epicatchin, which is in green tea, and so you can use that, which is a very non-toxic compound, to basically build the systems as well. So we've got those types of systems developed, and the last several years we've actually taken this and developed prototype systems. So this is a column that's got a membrane embedded wound in that, and these have now been produced with a commercial partner that we can actually implement at the site. We actually have a pilot unit that we could basically put there, and that's one of the things that we're looking at doing. This is sort of a cross-section of one of these membranes. So these things are rolled up, you have your flow is passing through this, and then it moves perpendicular through these basic filters, and ultimately kind of runs through multiple layers of these filters till it gets to the core, where you've got then your treated liquid that comes out of that. Another thing that we were able to determine is you can actually control how these filters operate by adjusting some of the chemistry of the water, specifically something called the pH. And as you vary the associated pH, that can actually affect how efficient the membrane is. So you can actually control the thing just using the chemistry. So for lower pHs, this internal structure basically is not as inhibitive, and so you have higher flows to the system. As you increase the pH, you can start to decrease the what's called the flux, or the flow through the membrane, and basically control how long the contaminated chemical is in contact with your metals, which will then increase the efficiency of the removal. So that's a summary of some of the technologies that we've developed with regard to TCE. We have now a treatment unit that could either be put at the pump and treat facilities down at the plant, or be used inside the building on the northwest facility, and we're currently in discussions with the folks at the plant, some of the new contractors and so on, how we might test that technology, because the technology has implications not only at Paducah, but a lot, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the Superfund sites, and a lot of the Superfund sites are also DOE facilities, so it has wide ramifications. So we think the technology is it's green, it's very cost effective, and we know technologically it works very well. Okay, so let me shift gears slightly here and now talk about another type of contamination at the site. This is a compound, or really a collection of compounds called PCBs. That's just for a long term called polychlorinated biphenyls. What that simply means is you have many chlorinated compounds. Biphenyls are these two little basically hexagons here. And these hexagons are simply, you have a series of carbon atoms that are all linked together with these double bonds. And so you have two little carbon atom bonds here, or carbon atom molecules. And then off of these you get chlorine atoms that basically get connected. And again, those chlorine atoms are the problem essentially. Although a biphenyl molecule itself can have some toxicity issues, so if you could figure out a way to get rid of those or break those down as well, that would be a second benefit. Okay, at the site there are PCBs due to several things. This is sort of a drawing of the site. These are the main process buildings. These use large compressors to force the DUF6 or the UF6 rather through these converters, and these things use a lot of energy. In fact, this plant, some people have pointed out, uses as much energy as the city of St. Louis or the city of Nashville. So this is a massive consumer of electricity. So there were these massive electrical yards that were built to basically provide the electricity to these buildings. And these electrical yards have electrical transformers, just like the ones you see on a electric pole. And it turns out when they made these transformers, they came up with a liquid chemical that they could put into these things to serve as an insulator. Okay, and so that's one of the uses of these PCBs. PCBs are a liquid, but they do not conduct electricity. So it became a way to build insulators for these. So as a consequence, over the years, with all these transformers, you had PCBs that would get spilled. There's a lot of PCB contamination from this electrical usage. Turns out the buildings themselves have ventilation systems and component parts that also have PCB fluids in them. So these buildings themselves have sources of PCBs and some of the equipment that were in those. And over the years, as this equipment was cleaned, over here at the C400 building, you also have potential contamination of PCBs there as well. And so this is again sort of a map of the site. The actual complex is here, and these little sort of black dots represent places where PCBs have been found in the soils or the sediment, and you can see it's some fairly significant contamination at the site. So one of the things we've been looking at, in addition to TCE, is how can we basically clean up these compounds as well. Now these compounds, PCBs, are probably a little more notorious depending on your perspective than TCEs. This slide kind of summarizes what are they, some of their physical characteristics. They're used for a lot of different other applications, electrical conductance. They don't basically burn that well. They're very stable compounds. They don't break down over time. So they've been used for a lot of things. I mentioned electrical transformers are also used in another electrical device called a capacitor, used for hydraulic fluids. Caulking. Recently, people have found some of the caulk that's been used in windows in schools. They found actually some PCBs in them, and also it's been used in ballast and fluorescent lights as well. So this stuff's pretty much everywhere historically, although it's been banned now. It's not being produced. Again, one of the reasons that they were used so extensively is because they're very stable compounds. They don't break down naturally or easily. So once they get into the environment, they're not going away on their own. Because these things are everywhere, they have gotten into the food supply, and they tend to be more prevalent in foods that have high fats. Okay, they're kind of attracted to fats. In fact, if you get them in your body, they tend to go where your fat is, and they stay there. This shows you some of the types of food that PCBs are higher in. You can kind of see, again, some of these, sometimes the salted butter, for example, has one of the highest concentrations. You also have some different types of foods, meats and so on. And all of these are basically in parts per billion. And again, these are some fairly high concentrations. The point is, everyone has PCBs in them. Okay, you have PCBs in you. Okay. And they can cause lots of problems. They can trigger inflammation processes. They can lead to other diseases, cancer, and so on. So just to provide a little bit of perspective, in addition to the Paducah site, there are a lot of other sites across the country that have some highly significant PCBs. One of the most notorious sites, so to speak, is a place in Anniston, Alabama, where they actually manufactured these things. And some people have called this the most polluted place in the United States. We also have PCBs in the Hudson River, the Great Lakes. This stuff gets into rivers. The Ohio River, for example, has got a lot of PCBs in it. San Francisco Bay, and so on. And so this has caused a lot of concern, obviously, with folks across the country. So how do we try to clean this stuff up? So in looking at trying to clean up PCBs, there again are two strategies. We kind of briefly looked at those when we were talking about TCE. We can use a process called a reductive strategy, where we basically can scavenge off the chlorine atoms by providing this additional electron or hydrogen atom. Or we can also use an oxidative strategy. We take iron, we add some hydrogen peroxide to it. This will generate a radical that will really just go and start yanking off the chlorine atoms that way. Sort of summarizing these strategies here, the reductive strategy will work. It'll pull those chlorine atoms off that biphenyl molecule, but it doesn't break down the biphenyl molecule. We'd like to get rid of that as well if we could. The reductive strategy is also relatively slow naturally, but as we've seen, if we add another little metal to it, like nickel or palladium in our case, then that can really speed the process up, and so that can help us. So we can use these nanoparticles with this second metal, and that will work. However, as we've talked about, we really can't put those in the environment. We need some way to basically keep them from doing that. And then so one strategy again is to embed these in a membrane so they can't get out, so to speak. And then we can build a reactor that we could then treat the chemical that way. So that would be one strategy. Another strategy is to go the oxidative process. Now, with regard to TCE, what we found was really the reductive strategy turned out to be probably the best way. Although theoretically the oxidative strategy could work, there's some problems with that because of the amount of hydrogen peroxide you would need and some other issues. But we can also use an oxidative strategy with regard to PCBs. One of the advantages of the oxidative strategy is it will actually break those rings down, okay? So we can break the rings down, but it still may not pull all the chlorine atoms. So now we have these sort of byproducts, and potentially those could be toxic. So ultimately, we like to break the whole thing down, so to speak. Another problem we saw is we had this very fast reaction, and we could get particles that get clumped together, and so they wouldn't be as efficient. But once again, if we take these particles and put them in a membrane, then that will allow us to kind of control the reaction rate. We talked briefly about how we can control the pH of the system and affect how the membrane system operates with regard to its speed or its reaction rate. And then by putting these compounds into membranes, we can also keep them from lumping together and make it more efficient. However, as we mentioned in the last case, we do have this challenge with regard to hydrogen peroxide. So if we had a lot of chemical to clean up, we need to bring that to the site to treat that. And there's some safety issues with hydrogen peroxide and so on. So we started thinking about that problem, and we think we came up with a fairly ingenious way to address that. And that is to have basically two other things that we can separate, put those in membranes, and we add them together, hydrogen peroxide will be generated in the membrane itself. So we don't have to bring this stuff from outside, we just bring some other, turns out to be very non-toxic compounds that when you combine them, hydrogen peroxide gets generated right there, and so that avoids this safety and transport issue, and that allows us to do that using some green technologies as well. So on the one hand, the reductive strategy will strip off the chlorines, leaves the biphenyl. The oxidative process will break down the biphenyl molecules, the two little hexagons there, but still leaves some of the chlorine. So now what we decided to do is, well, if we put these two treatment processes, these two membranes back to back, it turns out we can tackle both problems. We can both break down the biphenyl molecules and strip off the chlorine, and basically when we get done we have nothing toxic potentially whatsoever. So that's basically what we've been working on with regard to this strategy. This is a little cartoon that tries to summarize that. If we just use the reductive process, we would still have some of these mildly toxic biphenyl molecules. If we just use the oxidative process, we could break down the biphenyls but still have some of these chlorines attached. So what we do is we take the PCB molecule, we first run it through the reductive process. So we strip off all the chlorine atoms, this little green atom here, so we can strip that off. Then we can add hydrogen peroxide and basically run that through a membrane with these iron oxide nanoparticles that would either be ferrous oxide or essentially rust or magnetite, and that will then break up the basic biphenyl molecules that way. So that's the way that we've come up with. So we have these two membranes in series to do that. One of the key things is, or kind of the neat things is, well, how do we generate the hydrogen peroxide? And one of the things we can do is, turns out that if you take glucose or just sugar and you then add that to a natural biological enzyme for glucose, that when these two come in contact, hydrogen peroxide will get generated. Now, your body is generating hydrogen peroxide all the time inside you. You don't even know that. The reason it does that is when it generates the hydrogen peroxide, it will help generate these free radicals, and the body uses oxidation, this free radicals, to basically ward off invaders in your body. So it actually uses as a defense mechanism. The problem is if this process starts to get out of control, okay, and you end up with what's called oxidative stress. And so I'm sure you've heard in the literature, you want to take your antioxidants and so on. Well, all that's doing is trying to keep this natural process that occurs in your body from getting out of whack, so that you don't get too much oxidation going on, because if it gets out of hand, then that can start causing inflammation, which can lead to other diseases and so on. So essentially what we're doing is we're using the body's strategy here and put it into a membrane system so that we use basically sugar water, and this enzyme will generate the hydrogen peroxide that we can then use to couple with our iron oxide to break down these biphenyl molecules. So this now gives us these three different membrane systems in series. We can take our PCBs, liquid form, pass them through that system, and what comes out at the end basically is a non-toxic residue of carbon atoms and chlorine atoms in suspension. So it's not just the chlorine atoms themselves that cause a toxicity, it's the way when they get binded with these other atoms to form these PCB molecules. Those molecules interact in the cells in our body and trigger things that are bad. Obviously, chlorine is in sodium chloride, salt, so we eat that all the time. It's just not the chlorine itself, it's how it's linked together. Okay, so that kind of summarizes that process. Just to kind of conclude where we are in some of this research, what we've been able to demonstrate is these nanostructured immobilized systems turn out to be very effective for breaking down both TCE using a reductive process or PCBs using this combination of this reductive and oxidative pathway. And the enhanced reactivity of these iron palladium nanoparticles embedded in these membranes turns out to be a way to really enhance this generation of our free radicals for breaking down the chlorine atoms or breaking them away from the molecules. Certainly with regard to PCBs and TCE, we've been able to come up with technologies that basically turn these compounds into the non-toxic residues that will then clean up the sites. And so we've taken this technology not just from the lab, but we've actually commercialized these membrane processes. We've been working with a company called Ultra in California that's now changed their name to Nanostone. And we now have a prototype that we could take anywhere, install at any site, and as I indicated at the outset, we're looking to implement this down at the Paducah site in concert with their existing pump and treat system, and then hopefully, based on some of the data we expect to get back from that, can improve the process that can be applied to other sites across the country. And so that's a real quick synopsis then of some of the work we've been working on with regard to this technology. Again, Dr. Bhattacharya at the University of Kentucky has been the project lead on this, has really led the effort, and all the additional work has been done by his various graduate students that are highly sought after in the industry because of their expertise and a lot of the work that they've done.